It started with a quiet moment in a fading chapel, an unexpected confession that rippled through the calm walls of St. Mary's Seminary in Minneapolis. The place had held many secrets over the decades, but none as heavy as the one that would break free on a cold autumn evening of 2025. Father Thomas O'Rourke, a man now in his 90s and visibly frail, called for a group of seminarians to gather near his bedside. His voice, trembling yet clear, carried the weight of a lifetime of hidden truths. These young men, brimming with faith and hope, were about to learn a secret that would challenge their beliefs and shake the very institution they were preparing to serve. The seminary room smelled faintly of antiseptic and incense. The cross on the wall above Father O'Rourke's bed caught the dim light from the bedside lamp, its shadow stretching long across the floor. His thin fingers clutched a rosary, moving slowly between the beads, as if measuring each word that was about to leave his lips. "I've kept this for too long," he said, "and my silence has done more harm than my sins ever could." The seminarians exchanged uneasy glances. Among them sat Michael Donovan, a final-year student known for his curiosity and moral conviction. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the old man, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. The story Father O'Rourke began to tell reached back over 60 years, to the bitterly cold nights of November 1963 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It centered on Eleanor Finch, a bright and ambitious young journalist whose promising life was cut short by a brutal murder near the banks of the Mississippi River. Eleanor had been investigating local corruption, rumors of a money laundering operation, connected to city officials and possibly even members of the clergy. Her death at just 23 sent shockwaves through the city, but over time her name faded into obscurity as justice never came. The police called it a robbery gone wrong. No suspects, no solid leads, just another unsolved tragedy in a city that preferred its secrets buried under snow. But to Father O'Rourke, Eleanor's death wasn't random. He had known her. The priest's eyes filled with foggy memories as he recounted the days leading up to that night. He spoke of late confessions from men of influence, of envelopes passed in silence, and of a dangerous curiosity in Eleanor that drew her into places she didn't belong. "She was brave," he whispered, "braver than most of us will ever be. But bravery has a cost." As he spoke, the room grew still. The young seminarians could sense the shift in him. This wasn't a story meant for the confessional. This was a reckoning, a dying man confronting his past in front of witnesses who still believed in absolution. He described the evening of her disappearance. November 14th, 1963. A freezing wind swept across the Mississippi, carrying flakes of snow and the scent of iron from the mills. O'Rourke, then only 30, was a new priest assigned to St. Matthew's Parish, a small church just blocks from where Eleanor's body would later be found. He remembered hearing her name whispered among parishioners, then seeing her photographs in the morning paper, her lifeless face frozen in a haunting expression. But that night, he had seen something the police never knew. A car parked near the church, headlights off. Two figures inside, one in a suit, the other wearing a clerical collar. He had recognized both. Father O'Rourke paused, his breath shaky. "I saw them arguing," he murmured. "I saw her get out. And she never came back." The seminarians' faces turned pale. One of them, a young man named Aaron, shifted uncomfortably, whispering a prayer under his breath. "It wasn't just a robbery," O'Rourke continued. "She had uncovered something that implicated men who thought they were untouchable. And the church chose silence." He stopped there, clutching at his chest for a moment, as one of the nurses rushed in to check his pulse. But the priest waved her away, insisting he finish his story. "God won't take me yet," he said. "Not until I speak it." He confessed that he had known about the cover-up, that senior clergy had met privately with city officials and detectives to make sure Eleanor's death was written off as an unsolved mugging. He hadn't spoken out, afraid of what it would cost him, his career, his faith, his life. But guilt, he said, was the heaviest cross to carry. Outside, the chapel bells tolled the hour, echoing through the cold night air. Inside, all that could be heard was the slow, rasping breath of the old priest. One of the seminarians asked softly, "Father, who were the men in that car?" O'Rourke turned his face toward the window. The silence stretched long and heavy before he answered. One was a city official, he said. The other was a man of the cloth, a man who wore this collar with pride. I've spent my life trying to forget his face. The room went still. The name hung just beyond reach, suspended in the air between truth and fear. The priest's voice broke slightly, the weight of years pressing down on him. I can't give you absolution for what I failed to do, he said, his voice weaker now. But maybe you can do what I could not. Then he handed them a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and brittle. It had no title, only initials carved faintly into the corner. E.F. Michael took the notebook carefully, realizing it might hold the pieces of a puzzle long thought unsolvable. In that moment he understood that this confession was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Father O'Rourke sank back into his pillow, exhausted. The seminarian sat frozen, the room thick with disbelief. Outside, the wind pressed against the stained glass windows, whispering through cracks in the old walls of St. Mary's. The truth, once whispered, had finally found its voice, and now someone would have to decide what to do with it. The notebook felt heavier than it looked, its leather cracked, its pages yellowed with age. Michael Donovan held it as though it were something sacred, unsure whether to open it there, in the dim light of the infirmary, or wait until morning. Around him, the other seminarians spoke in hushed, uncertain tones, still trying to make sense of what they had heard. Father O'Rourke had fallen asleep, or perhaps lost consciousness. His breathing had grown shallow, and the rhythmic sound of the rosary beads slipping through his fingers filled the silence. Michael looked down at the small book again, the initials E.F. pressed into the corner, and could almost feel the presence of the woman behind them, Eleanor Finch. That night, he couldn't sleep. The seminary was quiet, but his mind refused rest. The wind rattled the window panes, and the occasional footsteps of the night porter echoed through the corridors. Michael sat at his desk in the dormitory, the notebook before him. One candle burned low, its flickering light tracing shadows across the pages as he finally opened it. The first entries were dated late summer, 1963. Eleanor Finch had a clear, purposeful hand, neat, sharp strokes that belonged to a woman determined to be taken seriously, in a world that often refused to take women seriously at all. She wrote of political gatherings, whispers of police corruption, and a series of suspicious payments flowing between city departments and a charitable foundation affiliated with St. Matthew's Church. Each entry carried a sense of urgency, a growing realization that she had stumbled upon something dangerous. One passage stood out to Michael. They think I don't know who's behind it, but I've seen his face in the cathedral, the man of God who blesses the guilty. He reread the line twice, then turned the page. The entries grew darker as November approached. References to late-night meetings, men following her. A growing fear etched into every sentence. Her final note, dated November 13th, read simply, "If I disappear, it won't be by chance." Michael sat back, the air leaving his lungs like the wind from a collapsing sail. This wasn't just a confession. This was evidence that could rewrite a forgotten chapter of the city's history. But he was just a student, not a detective, and the institution he served might not welcome what he had found. The next morning, Michael sought out Father O'Rourke. But the nurse told him the priest had passed away hours earlier, not long after his confession. The news hit the young man harder than he expected. He stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door to the infirmary, knowing that now the old man's story rested solely in his hands. At breakfast, whispers circulated among the seminarians. Some wanted to forget what had happened. Others insisted it was their duty to report the confession to the archdiocese. But Michael couldn't let it go. Something inside him, perhaps faith, perhaps guilt, pushed him to keep searching. He decided he would go to the place where Eleanor Finch had been found all those years ago, the riverside beneath the stone bridge downtown, where the cold case had begun. That evening he left the seminary quietly, pulling his coat tighter as the wind off the Mississippi bit into his face. Minneapolis in late November had a way of swallowing light early. The sun dipped fast behind industrial silhouettes, and the city filled with a dim orange haze. When he reached the riverfront, the water moved slow and dark, reflecting the faint shimmer of bridge lamps above. Standing there, Michael tried to imagine that night in 1963, the crunch of footsteps on icy ground, Eleanor's breath visible in the freezing air, and the shadowed figures arguing in the distance. The notebook remained clasped in his hands, pages fluttering slightly in the wind as if alive. He noticed something then, a small plaque embedded near the base of the bridge. It bore Eleanor's name along with the year of her death, worn nearly smooth by decades of weather. Someone at some point had remembered her. But beyond that token of pity, she'd been all but erased. Michael knelt beside the plaque, placing his fingers gently over the inscription. He thought of Father O'Rourke's haunted eyes, the weight behind every word of his confession. There was something about this place, the emptiness of it, that told him the old man had spoken truth. He didn't know yet how, but he was certain her death had not been random. The stillness broke when a car passed slowly on the bridge above him. Its headlights swept across the stone and caught on something nearby, a rusted cross half buried in the dirt. Michael brushed the snow away and saw faint words engraved at the base. For EF, in memory. He frowned. If the city had dismissed her death so easily, who had placed this here? Back at the seminary, Michael sought answers. He began digging into archives and parish records in the small library, long after midnight. Most files from 1963 were missing or incomplete, but through old diocesan newsletters, he found a photograph, a charity dinner hosted by St. Matthew's Foundation that same year. In it, sitting at the head table, were city officials, and among them, the unmistakable face of a priest wearing a velvet clerical stole, smiling beneath chandeliers, Father Patrick Leland. Michael's pulse quickened. He recognized the name. It was carved into plaques, honored in sermons, even spoken proudly by his instructors. Father Leland had later become a Monsignor, a pillar of the Minneapolis church community for decades. But in Eleanor's notes no name appeared, only that phrase, "The man of God who blesses the guilty." Could it have been him? Michael didn't want to believe it. Yet everything began to align. The dates, the mention of the church foundation, the proximity of the events. He flipped through the notebook again and found a hasty sketch, two symbols drawn side by side. One was a circular church emblem, the other the seal of the city council. Eleanor had been tracing the link between them, and she must have realized the church's connection to a municipal bribery scheme. That discovery had cost her her life. He closed the notebook, heart pounding. He knew what he held wasn't just an artifact. It was a key to unlocking a truth that others had kept hidden for 6 decades. But exposing it would mean confronting figures who still commanded tremendous influence. The church had never favored those who unearthed its buried sins, and the city, though modernized, had powerful families with long memories. Outside, snow began to fall again, laying a soft white shroud over the seminary grounds. Michael stared through the frosted window pane, clutching the notebook tightly. In his mind, he could still hear Father O'Rourke's trembling confession echoing, "Maybe you can do what I could not." And in that moment, Michael made a silent vow. He would not let the truth die again. The following morning, the air over Minneapolis carried a sharp edge, the kind that made every breath bite at the lungs. Michael walked through the narrow streets leading to St. Matthew's Parish, his gloved hands deep in his coat pockets, the notebook safely hidden beneath his arm. The church loomed in the distance, its steeple cutting into a grey sky heavy with snow clouds. He had seen its silhouette countless times from the seminary grounds, but today it felt different, ominous, alive. Inside, the church smelled of wax and cold stone. Candles burned low along the altar, their flickering light dancing across sacred statues. He took a seat on one of the pews near the back, his breath still visible in the sanctuary's chill. At that hour, only a handful of parishioners knelt in silent prayer, their whispers blending into the soft hum of the organ. Michael's eyes wandered along the side walls, where portraits of past priests hung beneath bronze plaques. There it was again, the warm, confident face of Monsignor Patrick Leland, immortalized in a frame of gold leaf. His gaze was direct, almost comforting. But now that Michael knew what he knew, that smile looked different. It wasn't one of benevolence, it was one of control. A deep voice behind him broke the silence. "You're from St. Mary's Seminary, aren't you?" Michael turned. A man in his 50s, wearing a dark wool coat and a grey clerical collar, stood watching him. His hair was neatly combed, and his expression carried that polite but probing detachment many churchmen mastered. The name tag pinned to his coat read, "Father Raymond Keene, Parish Administrator." "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "Michael Donovan." Keene gave a slight nod. "I knew Father O'Rourke." "Good man. Stubborn as they come. I heard he passed." Michael hesitated. "He did, a few nights ago." "I see." Keene's eyes lingered on him a moment, then shifted toward the altar. "He served here briefly back in the 60s. Left suddenly, health reasons, they said. We all owe him much." There was something calculated in his tone, like each word had been measured before release. He smiled faintly. "You know, people still talk about the old days, as if they were holy times. But not everything back then was as righteous as it seemed." Michael felt the weight of that statement. Was Keene testing him? He wanted to ask if the priest knew about Eleanor Finch, but decided it was too risky. Instead, he thanked him for the conversation and slipped quietly out of the church. Outside, the sky had begun to darken again, snow drifting lazily across the old cobblestone streets. He needed more information, something tangible that connected Leland to Eleanor's death. So he went where journalists once went when they couldn't find truth. The archives. The Minneapolis Tribune building stood several blocks away, its architecture a relic of a different era, with columns still bearing soot from the days of coal heating. Inside, the scent of old ink and newsprint was unmistakable. Michael approached the reception desk, clutching the notebook under his coat. "I'm doing research on unsolved cases from the early 60s, he explained. "Specifically Eleanor Finch." The archivist, a woman in her 70s with sharp glasses perched on her nose, tilted her head. "Eleanor Finch!" "Yes, I remember her. Bright girl. They said she was working on a story that got her into trouble. Tragic business, that one." She stood, motioning him to follow. "Come with me. Maybe you'll find something worth your while." They descended into the lower archives, where shelves of bound newspapers filled an entire room. Dust sparkled in the fluorescent light as she pulled a volume marked November 1963 Woust from the stack and placed it before him. Michael flipped through the pages, scanning headlines until finally he found it. "Young reporter found dead near riverfront. Police suspect robbery." The brief article cited few details. No suspects, no follow-up. But buried in the corner of the same page, a smaller piece caught his attention. A report on a charitable dinner at St. Matthew's Foundation, held the night before Eleanor's death. The guest list included city officials and prominent clergy, one of them being Father Patrick Leland. "Do you have photos from that event?" he asked. The woman adjusted her glasses, pulling a smaller folder from the cabinet. Within it were photographs clipped from the society pages, grainy black and white stills of smiling men shaking hands, raising glasses, and posing by the altar. In one frame, Eleanor Finch appeared at the table's edge, her face half-turned, eyes fixed not on the camera but on someone across from her. The man in question, though blurred, looked unmistakably like Leland. Michael felt a chill creep up his back. He thanked the archivist, tucked the photo safely inside the notebook, and left the building quickly. The streetlights had come on, slicing through the swirling snow in amber halos. His breath fogged the air as he hurried back toward St. Mary's Seminary, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him with every step. That evening, he pored over the photo under the pale glow of a desk lamp. There was no question anymore. Eleanor had attended that dinner. But why? She couldn't have been invited without reason. He flipped to the back of her notebook, where a folded page had come loose. It was a list of names and dates, city contractors, church donors, and amounts next to each. Every figure neatly aligned with the time the parish's charity fund had grown inexplicably large. Father O'Rourke hadn't lied. The corruption had reached deep into both sides. The city and the church intertwined in cover-ups and money laundering. And Eleanor Finch had been the one person who nearly brought it to light before someone silenced her. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped him from his thoughts. He closed the notebook instinctively. The door creaked open, revealing Aaron, the youngest of the seminarians who'd heard the confession. "You're still up?" Aaron asked softly. "Couldn't sleep either." Michael nodded, cautious. Aaron stepped inside, glancing toward the notebook, but saying nothing. He looked uneasy, his voice breaking slightly. "Do you think it's real?" "What Father O'Rourke said?" Michael hesitated before responding. "I think it's more real than we want it to be." Aaron's eyes darted toward the window, where snow continued to fall. "Then what do we do with it?" The question hung heavy in the air. Michael didn't answer at first. He looked at the candle burning beside the notebook, the single flicker of light in the dark room. "We follow it," he said eventually. "Wherever it leads." Neither of them spoke again for a long moment. The wind howled outside, and somewhere deep within the seminary, the old grandfather clock tolled midnight. The sound rolled through the hallways like a warning. The city slept beneath its familiar blanket of snow, but within those cold stone buildings, old ghosts had begun to stir once more. And for the first time since 1963, St. Matthew's Parish was no longer silent. Morning came heavy and grey. The bells of St. Mary's Seminary rang out over a city buried in snow, their sound low and hollow against the frozen streets. Michael woke to a faint ache behind his eyes after a restless night filled with thoughts of Eleanor Finch, Father Leland, and the web of deceit tying them together. The notebook lay open on his desk, the photo from the charity dinner, now framed by morning light. Eleanor's eyes still seemed to stare through the decades, watchful, defiant, aware of something that no one else dared to see. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Leland's blurred silhouette beside her wasn't coincidence. She had been close enough to see him clearly, close enough to ask the wrong question. He needed more proof, something indisputable that connected the two. The problem was, most of the men listed in Eleanor's notes were long dead, and the few still alive would never talk freely. Power and preservation ran deep in Minnesota's old institutions, and they had perfected the art of silence long before Michael had been born. After breakfast, he decided to visit the diocese archive, an imposing stone building attached to the cathedral downtown. It wasn't open to the public, but as a seminarian he had limited access to study records. He told the receptionist he was doing research for a history paper on Minneapolis, parishes during the 1960s. She nodded without suspicion and led him to a small wooden room lined with filing, cabinets and microfilm machines. The smell of old parchment filled the air. Michael scrolled through reels of brittle documents until he reached the section marked St. Matthew's Foundation, Financial Logs, 1960-1965. The records were handwritten on onion skin paper, detailed down to every tithe and donation. One entry caught his eye. 2015 to 63 private contribution, P. Leland, $4,000. The date made his blood run cold. That was the same day Eleanor Finch's body had been found. He photographed the page with his phone, heart racing, and flipped ahead to the next logbook. More entries followed. Unexplained deposits from private benefactors, matching the names in Eleanor's notebook. The money flowed freely, then abruptly stopped in early 1964, the year after her death. That alone was damning, but it wasn't enough to accuse anyone outright. Then, as he turned another page, something unusual caught his attention. A typewritten note stapled to the end of the ledger, unsigned, but written in distinctive formal tone. Regarding the matter of the recent incident near the river, ensure Father Leland's involvement remains untraceable. Transfer official correspondence to the Foundation's external office. All parish statements must omit the victim's name. Michael stared at the page, feeling the air drain from the room. There was no question now. Someone had deliberately covered up Leland's connection. This was the confirmation Father O'Rourke's dying words had hinted at. He slipped the page into his folder, tucked the notebook under his coat, and left the archive before anyone could stop him. Outside, the wind howled fiercely, pushing icy flakes sideways across the cathedral courtyard. He hurried toward the bus line, his mind spinning. Each clue pulled him deeper into a conspiracy no one wanted reopened, and he couldn't help wondering, how far would someone go to keep the past buried? Back at the seminary, Aaron met him at the entrance, his face pale. "Michael," he whispered urgently, "you need to see this." He led him down the hall to the bulletin board near the chapel. Pinned at the center was a black-bordered announcement from the diocese's press office. Monsignor Patrick Leland, hospitalized after sudden collapse. The note mentioned his deteriorating health and requested prayers from the congregation. Michael felt a strange churn of emotion, relief mixed with dread. If Leland was on his deathbed, was justice finally within reach? Or would he take everything to the grave just as Father O'Rourke had feared? "Do you think this is connected?" Aaron asked. "The timing, I mean?" Michael didn't answer. Part of him wanted to take it as divine providence, but the rational side knew better. Someone might have warned Leland, Or maybe he had found out about the confession. That afternoon, Michael visited St. Jude's Hospital, claiming to be a theology student seeking to offer a prayer. The nurse at the reception allowed him through after a short wait. He found Leland in a private room, surrounded by medical machines that seemed to hum in unison with his failing heart. The Monsignor looked far older than the smiling photograph in the church hall. His face was sunken, his skin almost translucent. Yet his eyes, sharp and grey, still held authority. When he saw Michael approach, his lips curved faintly into recognition. "Seminarian," Leland said slowly. "I know that look. You've been digging where others learned not to." Michael swallowed hard. "I'm trying to understand what happened to Eleanor Finch." For a moment, the only sound was the beeping of the monitor. Leland's eyes drifted toward the crucifix on the wall, then back to Michael. "She was persistent," he murmured. "Too persistent." "So was the truth," Michael said. "Until it caught up with you." A faint smile flickered across Leland's face. "You think truth is clean, young man? It's never clean. It's survival wrapped in penance. What Father O'Rourke told you, it wasn't his secret alone." "What do you mean?" Michael asked. But Leland's breathing grew shaky. He motioned toward the bedside table, where a rosary lay beside a folded sheet of paper. Michael hesitated, then picked it up. On the inside, written in a trembling hand, were 3 words. "It wasn't me." Michael looked back at the priest, confused. "Who then?" He pressed, but Leland's eyes had already closed. The monitor beeped once, twice, then fell silent. Nurses rushed in, but it was too late. Outside the hospital room, Michael felt cold to his core. The note in his pocket felt like a riddle, a deflection or a final plea for absolution. But what did "it wasn't me" mean? Leland had been at the charity dinner. The financial logs pointed to him. The confession implicated him. So who else had something to lose? When he returned to the seminary, the city was silent under heavy snowfall. He opened Eleanor's notebook again, studying the list of names she'd written. Toward the bottom, one entry was slightly smudged, as if someone had brushed a thumb across the ink before it dried. Next to Father Leland's name was another. R. Keene. Father Raymond Keene, a chill cut through. Michael sharper than the winter air itself. The man who had greeted him so politely in St. Matthew's, the one who had spoken of O'Rourke with calculated sympathy. He had been part of it all along. Suddenly, everything made sickening sense. Keene wasn't just preserving the past. He was guarding it, making sure no one unearthed the truth Father O'Rourke had carried to his grave. But Michael was no longer just a student. He was the keeper of a story waiting to break open, one that could pull down everything built on silence and shame, and if Father Keene thought he could stop that from happening. He was about to learn that the sins of 1963 had not been forgiven, they had only been waiting. The snow that night refused to stop. Minneapolis lay buried beneath a white hush, the streets almost unrecognizable, the city lights softened into ghostly halos. Inside St. Mary's Seminary, the heat clicked weakly through the old radiators, and Michael sat alone in the library, the notebook open before him once more. He stared at the name, R. Keene, written in Eleanor's sharp but trembling hand. Father Raymond Keene. The realization gnawed at him. It hadn't been Leland alone. Keene had been there too, close enough to Eleanor to know her movements, to erase her from the record when it was over, and to keep the story buried for decades. He had inherited not only St. Matthew's parish, but its sins as, well, Michael thought back to that first encounter in the church when Keene had mentioned O'Rourke's stubbornness and the old days. His phrasing hadn't been nostalgic. It had been cautious, controlled. Keene hadn't been reminiscing. He had been gauging whether the young seminarian already knew. Michael flipped through Eleanor's final entries again. There were short notations in the margins. Meeting near rectory, watching from the church steps. He pretends to be holy. Only now did they align with what he'd begun to suspect. The man under the clerical collar might have been a confidant at first, perhaps someone Eleanor approached thinking he could be trusted. But what she'd found instead was danger. He needed to confirm just how deep Keene's involvement went. That afternoon, while the other seminarians attended lectures, Michael walked the long path back to St. Matthew's. The front doors were open, the sanctuary dimly lit. He found Keene in the sacristy, arranging chalices and vestments for the evening mass. his movements deliberate and calm. "You're here again," Keene said without turning. "You young men of St. Mary's have an unusual sense of devotion." Michael forced his voice to stay steady. "I have questions about Father O'Rourke's time here." "About Eleanor Finch?" Keene froze for a beat, then slowly turned. His eyes, grey and deceptively soft, rested on Michael with quiet scrutiny. "That name again." He clasped his hands behind his back. "You do realize the danger of repeating stories better left where they belong?" "With respect, Father," Michael said, "I think the danger lies in pretending they never happened." A faint smile creased Keene's expression. "A fine answer. You remind me of O'Rourke when he was young, idealistic, naive to the cost of truth." Michael stepped closer. "You were there the night she died. Your name is in her notes." "Notes?" Keene's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Be careful, son. Accusations are easy when the dead can't defend themselves." "She wrote about you," Michael pressed. "She wrote that she trusted someone from the church, someone who betrayed her." "You were that man." The older priest's demeanor shifted. The warmth drained from his tone, replaced by the cold certainty of authority. "Do you know what the world was like in 1963, boy? The city was crawling with men who thought they owned it, judges, detectives, officials. The church was the one place they needed clean. Eleanor Finch was foolish enough to believe she could expose them. And when she came to the parish, she brought ruin to more than herself." "That doesn't excuse her death," Michael said. Keene's jaw tightened. "No, but truth rarely dies with just one person. It demands more. It feeds until there's nothing left to burn." Michael felt the silence stretch between them, a tension thick enough to choke the air. "What happened that night?" he asked quietly. Keene stared at him for a long moment. The clock in the sacristy ticked once, twice, before he spoke again. "She wasn't supposed to die," he said at last. "We only meant to scare her, make her drop the story. Leland thought he could handle it. But when she ran, when she screamed, panic does terrible things to a man of God." Michael's heart pounded. "So you were there?" "I disposed of the evidence," Keene confessed calmly. "The car, her notes. Everything but that damned plaque someone put up by the river. The church rewarded my loyalty with silence. They called it repentance. I called it necessity." He turned away, adjusting the vestments on the table, as if to remind himself who he was supposed to be. "You see, Michael, O'Rourke never forgave me. That's why he left. He couldn't live with what he'd heard in confession." Michael's throat tightened. "He carried your sins for 60 years, and he broke his vow on his deathbed," Keene said sharply. "You think confession is some newspaper headline you can print for the world? No, it's sacred, even if it means protecting monsters." The young seminarian stepped closer, his voice trembling but certain. "You don't deserve that collar." Keene looked at him with something like pity. "And what will you do with your righteousness then? Run to the press? To the police? Who will believe a seminarian over the word of a priest with 50 years of service?" Michael didn't answer. He turned toward the door, clutching the notebook against his chest. "Maybe no one will believe me," he said, "but they'll believe her." With that, he left the sacristy, the echo of his footsteps fading through the empty nave. Behind him, Keene stood motionless, the color draining from his face. For the first time, it seemed the past had caught him unprepared. That night, Michael decided to act. He scanned and copied every page from Eleanor's notebook, every photograph, every parish document he'd found. He reached out to a journalist at the Star Tribune, a woman named Angela Reese, known for resurrecting old stories long buried by politics. He didn't reveal his identity in the message, only claiming to have evidence that could solve one of Minneapolis's oldest unsolved murders. The reply came within an hour. "Meet me tomorrow, 6 p.m. Stonebridge. Bring proof." He knew it was risky. If Keene realized Michael had spoken, he might destroy the remaining evidence or worse. But silence had already claimed too many lives. He wasn't about to let it win again. That night, as the seminary lights dimmed and snow continued to fall outside, Michael packed the notebook into his bag and knelt by his bed. For a long moment he prayed, not for the safety of his soul, but for the strength to do what was right. When he finally opened his eyes, the candlelight flickered against the wall, casting two distinct shadows, one his own, and one that seemed to linger just beside him, faint but unyielding. The ghosts of 1963 were still awake. Tomorrow, he promised himself, Eleanor Finch's story would finally be heard. Snow drifted over the Mississippi like silent ash. Minneapolis glowed faintly through the haze, each streetlight mirrored by the black water below. Michael waited on the stone bridge, his breath forming pale clouds that vanished into the cold. In his satchel, Eleanor Finch's notebook rested beside copies of the documents, the proof he hoped could finally end 62 years of silence. At 5:45 p.m., he saw a figure approach through the snow. Angela Reese, reporter for the Star Tribune, walked toward him with measured steps, her scarf whipping in the wind. "You're the seminarian," she said without greeting. Her tone mixed curiosity with caution. "You said you had proof about the Finch case." "I do," Michael replied, offering her the envelope. "Everything we found leads back to St. Matthew's Church." Angela opened it, flipping through the pages quickly. "These are her notes," she said, half to herself. "The handwriting matches archival samples." "Where did you get them?" "From a priest, Father O'Rourke," Michael said. "He confessed before he died last week." Angela frowned. "And you think this confession ties the church directly to her murder?" "I don't think," Michael answered quietly. "I know." The wind howled across the bridge, rattling the metal rails. Angela glanced over the documents again, stopping at the photograph of the 1963 charity dinner. "That's her, Eleanor. And that's Monsignor Leland right beside her." She traced her glove along the faded outline. "God, he looks untouchable." "He was," said Michael. "But he's gone now. The one who's still alive is Father Keene. He confessed to burying the evidence." Angela studied him. "You have a recording?" "No, only my word and Eleanor's." "That's not enough," she muttered. "We'll need verification. Handwriting analysis, bank records, someone who remembers the night she died." "I'll get whatever's needed," Michael said firmly. Before Angela could reply, footsteps crunched behind them. Both turned. From the shadow beneath the bridge, another figure emerged, tall, steady, wrapped in a long, dark coat. Father Raymond Keene. For a moment, no one moved. The wind pressed harder, carrying with it the low groan of the river below. "So this is where the truth comes to die," Keene said softly, his breath curling in the cold. "I warned you, Michael. Curiosity isn't faith." Angela's voice cut sharp through the silence. "You followed him here?" "I followed the noise," Keene replied. His expression was calm, almost sorrowful. "There are things you don't understand. The world was different then. The city needed order, even if it meant compromise." "Compromise," Michael snapped. "Who you call murder that?" "She was supposed to walk away," Keene said. "But she didn't. And when people like her refuse to stop digging, the whole house comes down." Angela pulled out her phone and started recording. "Father Keene, are you admitting to your involvement in Eleanor Finch's death?" Keene's eyes drifted to her hand. "Turn that off." "No," she said. "Say it again." The priest sighed, reaching slowly into his coat. For a second, Michael thought he was pulling out papers, until the metallic glint of an old revolver caught the light. "Run!" Michael shoved Angela toward the end of the bridge. The first shot cracked through the silence, scattering birds into the night. Michael staggered back, pain searing his side. The second shot went wide, striking the railing. Angela dove behind a pillar, fumbling for her phone as the priest approached. "Stop!" she shouted. "It's over, Father. Everyone will know." Keene looked at her with weary eyes. "Knowing changes nothing." Michael pushed himself up, blood staining his coat. "It changes everything," he said, voice trembling. "It sets her free." Keene hesitated, gun lowering slightly. Snowflakes melted against the barrel. "You remind me of O'Rourke," he murmured. "He thought righteousness could save him, too." "It did," Michael said. "It will save her." The sirens reached them faintly, growing louder from across the river. Someone had heard the gunshots. Keene's expression shifted. Fear, resignation, maybe relief. He looked at Michael for the last time. "Then let God judge the rest." Before anyone could move, he stepped backward over the railing. The water swallowed him without a sound. Angela rushed to Michael, pressing her hands to his side. "Stay with me," she said. "They're almost here." The lights of police cars broke through the gloom as officers stormed the bridge. Paramedics knelt beside Michael, cutting through his coat, bandaging the wound. Angela handed them the satchel with trembling hands. "This," she said, "is everything." Hours later, Michael woke in a quiet hospital room. The city outside his window lay grey and still under morning snow. Angela stood nearby on her phone, her face pale but composed. When she hung up, she looked at him and smiled faintly. "It's out," she said. "They reopened the Finch case. Keene's confession is all over the Tribune." Michael closed his eyes. The pain lingered, but so did something else, relief. "What about her?" he asked softly. Angela gestured to the notebook resting on the bedside table, sealed in a clear evidence bag. "Her story's finally being told, Michael. She's free." Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and endless. The river that once hid her secret now carried her truth through a city that had forgotten her. 62 winters late, Eleanor Finch's voice finally rose from the cold. Winter lingered long over Minneapolis that year. Snow crusted the windows of the courthouse, muffling the sound of passing cars, as if the world outside were holding its breath. Inside, the air was tense. Reporters filled every bench, cameras waiting for the first words of testimony in the reopened case of Eleanor Finch, the story that had begun in shadows more than 6 decades ago. Michael sat in the back row, pale but recovering. A bandage still wrapped his side beneath his coat. Each morning, as he looked at the cold light of the city, he reminded himself of why he had come this far. Not for redemption, but for justice long denied. Angela Reese stood at the front with her notebook in hand. Her articles had ignited a storm. The front pages now carried Eleanor's name beside words like cover-up and confession. What started as one priest's dying admission had turned into a full-scale investigation involving detectives, church officials, and the remnants of a generation that thought itself untouchable. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on the evidence Michael had uncovered: the diary, the financial ledgers, and the recording of Keene's final confrontation, retrieved from Angela's damaged phone. Forensic experts confirmed Eleanor's handwriting, and bank trails linked parish accounts to city officials known for corruption in the 1960s. As the proceedings opened, the lead prosecutor rose. "For 62 years, he said, addressing the court, a young woman's death was buried under sacrilege and silence. Today we bring her truth into the open air." The defense, made up of attorneys representing the church, argued that Keene's death rendered the matter irrelevant, that the institution itself could not stand trial for sins of individual men, but the public saw it differently. For many, this was not about punishment anymore. It was about reckoning. Michael's turn to testify came late in the second week. The courtroom fell quiet when he approached the stand. His voice trembled at first, then steadied. He recounted everything: O'Rourke's confession, the notebooks, the meeting at Stone Bridge, and Keene's last words before he vanished into the river. "Why did you pursue this?" the prosecutor asked. Michael paused, eyes glancing toward the evidence box holding Eleanor's belongings. "Because truth shouldn't freeze with the dead," he said softly. "She was silenced for doing what we're taught to believe in, seeking honesty. Someone had to listen." The gallery was silent. The judge nodded gravely before dismissing him. Outside, the city shifted uneasily under the flood of revelations. Parishioners protested in front of the courthouse, holding signs defending faith while demanding reform. The diocese issued statements accepting moral responsibility while denying operational guilt. Yet for the first time, the walls that once seemed impenetrable began to crack. Angela met Michael outside on the courthouse steps after his testimony. She held her recorder tightly in one hand, cheeks pink from the cold. "You did well," she said gently. "They believed you. Will she finally get peace?" he asked. "She already has it," Angela replied. "It's everyone else who's just waking up." Over the following months, the case rippled far beyond Minnesota. National outlets picked up the story, linking similar deaths, buried scandals, and old investigations that had gone nowhere. The church responded with vows of transparency and reform, though many saw it as damage control. Still, something undeniable had changed. Silence had lost its sanctity. By spring, the snow melted. Michael returned to St. Mary's Seminary, where life had slowly returned to routine. Some looked at him with respect, others with unease. He didn't blame them. Truth was always easier to admire from a distance. He kept teaching his classes on theology and ethics, balancing scripture with what he had learned in the gutter of reality, that righteousness means nothing without courage. One afternoon, a package arrived for him with no return address. Inside was a small frame holding an old black-and-white photograph. Eleanor Finch, standing beside a typewriter, smiling faintly, her eyes filled with the restlessness of those who dare to question. Beneath it was a note in familiar handwriting. "Thank you for listening." Angela must have sent it after the final verdict. The court had ruled the Finch case an official homicide, and the Church of St. Matthew's was ordered to fund a historical archive in her name. That night, Michael lit a candle in the seminary chapel. The sanctuary was quiet, except for the hum of the heating pipes and the faint creak of wood. He placed the photograph near the altar and bowed his head. "Forgive us," he whispered. The candlelight flickered across the crucifix, stretching long shadows across the floor. For the first time, he felt no fear in its presence. What once symbolized silence now seemed to breathe, alive, listening. Outside, spring rain began to fall over the city, washing the soot off the old stone buildings, carrying the last traces of winter into the river below. Somewhere beneath that same river lay secrets too heavy to recover, but above it, Eleanor Finch's story had risen like breath after a long dive. As Michael walked out of the chapel, the night air smelled faintly of thawing earth and wet pine. He paused on the steps, looking over the city lights reflecting in puddles on the pavement. The truth had cost lives, faith, and years, but it had also reclaimed one. And in that quiet moment, as the bells of St. Mary's rang over the waking city, he realized something simple. Justice doesn't erase the past, but it breaks its silence. For Eleanor, for Father O'Rourke, and for every secret kept too long, the silence had finally ended. A year after the trial ended, Minneapolis seemed quieter. The river still ran cold beneath the stone bridge, but the current no longer felt heavy with secrets. Snow had given way to spring rain, washing away the grey film of a city that had carried guilt for too long. Michael Donovan stood on the bridge, hands in his pockets, watching as water rolled endlessly beneath him. The same place that had nearly taken his life now felt like closure. Beside him, a new plaque gleamed under the evening light. Freshly polished, the brass catching every shimmer from the city skyline. Eleanor Finch. She told the truth when silence was easier. When he had first read those words, he'd thought them too poetic, too kind. Now he knew they were exactly right. The plaque wasn't placed by the church or the city. It was commissioned by ordinary people, students, reporters, even parishioners. Angela had written one last article about it, calling it the bridge between then and now. The story became a symbol of reckoning, of courage rediscovered. Michael heard footsteps behind him. Angela Reese approached, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, her camera hanging at her side. She smiled when their eyes met. "So you come here a lot," she said. "Habit," Michael replied. "Some places don't let go, even when they're done with you." "Or maybe you're not done with them," Angela said gently. They both leaned on the railing, watching the dark shimmer of the river. For a while neither spoke. Then she broke the silence. The diocese finished the new archive. They named it the Eleanor Finch Center for Truth and Faith. "They're digitizing all the files you found with O'Rourke's notes." Michael nodded slowly. "Good. That's what he wanted. Transparency. Confession that actually means something." Angela studied him. "You never told me why you stayed at the seminary." He smiled faintly. "Because you can't fix something by walking away from it. Faith isn't about pretending. One of my students asked last week if God forgives priests who lie. I told him God forgives everyone who stops hiding." Angela laughed softly. "You sound like a man who finally believes what he's saying." "Maybe I do." The wind rose between them, carrying the faint toll of church bells from the distance. The city lights began to blink on one by one, reflections dancing off the damp streets. Minneapolis was awake again, different yet somehow the same. "Do you ever wonder what she'd think?" Angela asked Eleanor. Michael's eyes lingered on the plaque. "She'd probably say it took us long enough." Angela smiled at that. For a moment, the tension that had lived between truth and tragedy felt lighter. A car passed across the bridge, headlights sweeping over them like a curtain of light. When it was gone, their reflections wavered on the water below, two people drawn together by a story that older generations had tried to bury. Neither hero, neither victim, just witnesses to what happens when silence meets conscience. Angela checked her watch. "I should go," she said. "Deadline calls." "The world's hungry for the next injustice." Michael nodded. "And you'll be there to feed it." "No," she replied with a grin. "Just to make sure someone's listening." She turned to leave, pausing for a moment to look back. "You did something that mattered, Michael. You gave her peace." Don't forget that." When she was gone, the bridge fell quiet again. Rain began to fall in light, steady drops that tapped gently against the metal rails. Michael stayed there a while longer, letting the moment sink in. He thought of Father O'Rourke's frail hand clutching the rosary, of Leland's grey eyes before death, of Keane stepping backward into the dark river. Every soul carried its reasons, but none of them excuses. And in their failures he'd found his answer. Faith was never the absence of sin. It was the act of facing it. Eventually he left the bridge and walked towards St. Matthew's Church. The building had been cleaned and restored, its doors open, its pews filled again. Inside, candles flickered in quiet vigil. Near the back, a bronze memorial had been added to the wall, featuring two names side by side. Father Thomas O'Rourke Elinor Finch, truth finds its voice when courage answers. Michael stood there, his reflection mingling with the light from the altar. He whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for peace. "May they rest," he murmured, "and may we never stop listening." Then he placed a small white lily at the base of the memorial and turned to leave. As he stepped outside, the bells struck 8, their sound deep and resonant, rolling over the rooftops of Minneapolis. The rain eased. The streets shimmered like mirrors as he walked away, his breath soft against the cooling air. The wind carried faint laughter from a nearby cafe, life continuing as it always had. Somewhere far beneath, the river flowed on, eternal, unburdened at last. Above it, truth had found its voice and silence had lost its power. Eleanor Finch's story was no longer a cold case. It was history. Healed and heard, and for the first time in decades the city could finally rest. For years these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.